Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is co-host Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Guess what we're going to talk about today? The election. Everybody wants to talk about election, but in a different fashion. We're not going to talk in particular about any one candidate and what they believe in, because I can't figure out what they believe in, and you know, most of them are untrustworthy. But what I want to concentrate on is a little bit about the process. You know, the rules, and are these fair elections that we're talking about? How important are the Republican rules? How important are the super-delegates? But first off, do you feel comfortable with the way our elections are run? Do you go away saying, you know, it's great, we're setting a grand example for the world on how to run elections?
It's funny, in a previous life, I was an election monitor overseas.
Ooh.
And I remember how we used to go in and we'd meet with the Electoral Commission. We would learn all the rules down to the finest detail. And, you know, if these things were not on the up and up, they were criticized, they were you know, said to be bad elections and everything. And our elections would never pass muster according to our own rules, I don't think.
Yeah, that's the big thing. But, you know, on the weekend there were some primaries, and Bernie won several, and they say he has some momentum. But then the subject came up about super delegates. I guess if you're a super candidate and you're very close to the establishment, the super delegates go to where the party directs them, and they direct them some way, and evidently Hillary has that lined up. So regardless of what Sanders does, you know, it's going to be you know, decided elsewhere. But the same way, the Republicans don't have the super delegates, but they have super control over the rules. And I remember the rules being changed a little bit 4 years ago. But yeah, this is what they rely on. But I don't see how the people can, you know, be so confident and just love this and say, and find these technicalities. What are the negatives? What are the positives? What does he say? What does he say? When the real power structure behind these elections is how these elections are managed. And over the years, I have become rather cynical about how elections are run.
It's interesting, you know, I think the media chooses to focus on the sporting event aspect of the race. He's got 400 and she's got 300 or what have you. But maybe it's to divert our attention from the fact that, as you point out, there seems to be something fundamentally unfair about the way presidents are chosen. The superdelegates, we saw a piece today on Zero Hedge that pointed out that if the superdelegates, who are people who were appointed, they never were voted for, if Sanders had simply gotten the superdelegates that Hillary just inherited somehow out of the sky, they would be telling her to drop out because she'd be so far behind. So the vote of the people for Sanders or Clinton has meant nothing at all in the race.
Yeah, but, you know, you're talking about not being elected and getting into a special slot is how do we pick our vice presidents? You know, we go through all this, and there's a lot of shenanigans goes on. Then we finally have our nominees, and then we say, Mr. Nominee, who's your choice for vice president? Of course, there's a lot of maneuvering behind the scenes, but it literally gets down to the nominee making this choice. And I think back at Reagan, and, you know, people were excited about Reagan, the independent conservative, really cracked down on big government. And a lot of people then wrote him off because he immediately picked somebody from the establishment, which is H.W. Bush, who became president later on, just merely by making that decision. So a lot happened. So I think it's a weak case for the democratic elections. Of course, democracy per se is nothing that the founders gave us, but they at least endorsed the idea that votes should be counted and you should have elections, and the democratic process should be respected to some degree. But I don't see how too many people could get very excited about it. I've complained so often about us killing people and then going in and saying, well, you're not like us. You don't have elections, and we'll bomb you, and we'll do this. And by golly, they have elections. But then they end up with somebody we don't like, and we do something to get rid of them. At the same time, here in this country, you know, it's hard to get on ballots. This idea that there's a two-party system, I think is wrong. But, you know, where the disconnect for me comes is if you had a truly free society, I think the parties would be very private. And they could have their rules and they could do whatever they want. And they say, okay, this is convention or what? This is what we're doing. But we don't have it. We have, parties that are ordained by the government. The government laws are mixed up on funding and everything else. Take, for instance, if we're involved in the Libertarian Party and somebody happened to have been picked that the next day a serious crime was committed and all that, we don't want him for our nominee. They would have the right to use their rules to remove one person and put them in. But under today's circumstances, it's government and political parties, and then you put in the mesh the media. And the media is involved in this. And then the other interesting factor that interferes with elections will be the deep state, the shadow government. And that's the part that is the one that's kept most secret. So I think if things get tough and conditions are bad and they have to keep the people in real ignorance, it's great to have this great personality fight going on, because certainly we don't want to talk about real issues, and then we end up, I think, with the mess that we have today, where elections are pretty irrelevant, and it brings out the worst in people, because I do believe that power is very corrupting. And the founders, of course, suggested we not even have political parties, but you're always going to have political factions, and it's a very good case for me to argue that centralized government is the worst kind. Little local government, the more local, the better, the more states power you have. But this whole idea that you have somebody at the national level, with so much power being controlled by the deep state and the shadow government, that's where I see the problem.
It's interesting. I was on a show last week with a Hillary Clinton supporter, and I mentioned what I felt was a fundamental unfairness of the super-delegate system. And he was kind of a rash, harsh guy, and he said, well, I bet the Republicans wish they had something like that. I said, yeah, they probably do. I don't disagree with you, but they do have their own, and you touched on it earlier, which is how they use the rules and they manipulate the rules. And this is something you know well, the infamous Rule 40B back in 2012.
Yes, and I was never naive. I knew it was an uphill race, and I had my motives and all this, but we actually were doing a lot better than I ever dreamed, because we started winning some of these states, and we were coming out. You take, for instance, when the dust settled, we totally won the caucus from Iowa. From Iowa, but it was never recognized because there were couple other winners that were before me, but when they counted the votes and divvied up the delegates, we overwhelmingly, more than 3/4 of the delegates were Ron Paul delegates. But they saw this coming, and they're just terrified of competition, because we were worrying about whether we had 5, 6, 7, or 8 states in that category, so the numbers weren't good, but they could not tolerate the idea that I would get on that stage and start talking about war, anti-war, or talking about the Fed and talking about how stupid the Republicans are in the way they spend money and how hypocritical. There was no way they were going to let that happen. So we qualified. You had to have plurality in 5 states. So our guys were aggressive. We did whatever we could, and we had the votes. And of course, if you see the replays of Boehner closing down some votes on the rule changes, boom, and even the yeas and the nays, I was surprised that the nays, which were our votes not to accept the new rules, they were pretty good, and that's when things got pretty rough. But they went and changed it to we needed not just 5 but 8, and it had to be majority. So it was a big change at the last minute. And the whole thing was, just don't let that guy say anything, because we're terrified of somebody who might talk about ideas, and we have to talk about junk, and that's what they do so far. And you think it's junkier now than ever before. I mean, just look at the discussions going on.
So they didn't want you to be kept from the nomination because they were afraid you would win, because they felt like they had that in the bag. They were afraid that you'd be able to open your mouth on the stage if you were nominated.
That was the main thing, but there were some, I was surprised at the response there. There were a lot of people very sympathetic, and just like now, they talk about delegates who aren't fully committed and they can change, and that's why the Republicans are anxious to put another name up. But the irony of all this is the Ron Paul rule is prohibiting them from doing that. So it's backfiring on them. But well, can't they change it? Sure, they can change it, but there's a political consequence on that. At the last minute, changing back, and Trump's not going to go away quietly. And then they have the threat of him going third party.
And of course, your run has popularized this idea of the rules. I don't think a lot of people paid a lot of attention before that, but now that the cat's out of the bag, they have to be a little bit more cautious and circumspect about it. But I've always wanted to ask you this. They didn't want you to speak at the convention, but did they offer you some kind of a deal if you let us write your speech, or if you?
Oh yeah, they would. It was never official. Nothing in writing, and nothing from the top. But it filtered over, and they said, you can have a speech, and I said, yeah, what do I do? I said, can I just get up and give a speech? No, we'd have to approve the speech. Then the other thing that they offered me, which was really like offering me what? They said, Romney would like you to sit in the box with him during the convention. I said, you want me to be a prop? So that's the way it works. But they're in a different world. And if you're dealing with ideas and you really believe in them and you stick to them, they have trouble dealing with a person like that. So,
but it's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say you put two things, but putting them together is even more interesting. You talked about how Reagan was considered a maverick, and he came in, and they put Bush there to maybe to calm him down. And then you talk about the deep state. But Bush, in my opinion, was the epitome of the deep state. CIA director, former U.S. ambassador to China. So he wasn't just an establishment guy, he was the deep state.
Yeah, but I remember back then, if anybody objected about the Northeastern establishment or something like that, they say, oh, you must be a John Bircher or something like that. They wanted to just write you off as some conspiracy person. But there were people who complained about it and knew about it, and it really was the case. It was moving it on. But it does raise the question about the deep state. How do they manage all this? And I think there's a tremendous collusion between the military, the financing of the military. I think our CIA is a big deal. I think they're the ones who orchestrate these other elections and the wars that go on, and I think they're over and above the president. I don't think the president has full control of the CIA, and then they certainly can't keep up with all the finances of the world. And what is so weird is we use these tools, and we can take a country that did not attack us, but we want to punish them, and that's Iran. And take in $150 billion and freeze that money. And then it's twisted around as we finally break the ice and try to live with them again. Oh, why are we giving them our money?
Our money.
It's the American people's money, and you still hear that in the campaign.
Nobody corrects it.
No, and the media doesn't do it.
But you mentioned this before the show, and I think it's a great point, that we do know that the CIA manipulates elections overseas. There's a history of it going way back to the 50s and before. We know that's a fact. And so you're saying, well, so what's to say that they're not involved somehow here in some way or the other?
I remember a long time ago when I was first in office in the 70s, I was communicating with a gentleman. He wrote for the magazines for the Birch Society, but he did not belong to the John Birch Society, but he had been in the FBI, and he was part of the FBI to help set up the CIA after World War II. And I brought up the subject of the CIA. He had some stories that tell me about that. But the one thing that stuck with me, he says, if you have a republic and you want a Republican, not a Republican Party, if you want to have a republic type of government, you cannot have a CIA, because they will run the show, they will be secret, they will deny, and they will be more powerful than the elected leader. So the elections, I believe, are just fluff. And I believe the media, there's a big fight between Fox and MSNBC, but is there a big fight on, is one calling for bringing the troops home from the Middle East? Did any of them stand up against the war? Sometimes they seem to compete on who's the most hawkish. And of course, the candidates are the most hawkish. But the Democrats, they're not supposed to be hawkish, so they pretend. But then all of a sudden, if people still don't believe this, that some neocons wouldn't be all that unhappy with Hillary, because of her hawkish foreign policy. She could run. If she didn't have the labels tagged to her, with her policy, she actually could run as a Republican.
In some ways, she's a perfect candidate for the neocons because not only is she very aggressive in foreign policy, but she's very much tied in with the money establishment, with the Goldman Sachs, with the financial establishment. So putting the two of them together, you have a perfect mix. But, I was looking before, I think there were some comments on Zero Hedge, and someone pointed out that the Clintons have been either in power or running for power for almost a third of a decade.
Yeah. So you're inferring that Clinton is close to Goldman Sachs. Does that mean that none of the Republican candidates are involved with Goldman Sachs?
Yeah.
Well, one thing for certain, the American people are unhappy. They're angry and they're justified for financial reasons, for foreign policy reasons, for personal liberty reasons, but they cannot be distracted by elections. This election has so little to do with real issues. And they need to read about the shadow government and the deep state and who really runs things and how the finances work and how the IMF works and how the bailouts work. And that's where the real power is. But the only thing I see that compensates for that is not having a greater force that can overcome them. The only force that can overcome them is a better idea. So it's ideological. We have to convince the American people that liberty is the answer, and you have to challenge the power of government, and that means the whole goal would be what the founders tried to do, and that is strictly limit the power of a central government. And it has failed totally. And not only have we a powerful central government, then we have another layer above this, and that is the deep state and the shadow government. And I think it's going to come an end because it won't function, because they believe that they can spend money endlessly and never save money, and they can tax endlessly and keep printing money. And it's failing, and that's why people are very unhappy. So this bickering going back and forth doesn't address the subject of the economic and the foreign policies that we have, but there's the opportunity there because this is coming down and the American people need to wake up and find out what they can do. It's an ideological struggle. The ideas are out there. The understanding is there. We just need to have the leadership in this country reverse from the Keynesian interventionist authoritarian approach to one that we accept, liberty and voluntarism. That to me would be the answer. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.